Inside a steel and concrete gun casemate, 5 miles southwest of the French city of Metz, a German officer stands very still and listens to the wall. It is early October, 1944. Outside, somewhere on the moonlit slope of Fort Driant, American howitzers are firing at the barbette over his head. The fort is built of steel-reinforced concrete poured in 1902, deepened by the French, deepened again by the Germans. The walls do not crack. The shells arrive, the wall shakes, dust falls from the ceiling, and the wall holds. The officer counts the seconds between impacts. He has been counting for days. He believes he is winning. Read that twice. Because by the standard logic of this war in October of 1944, he is not wrong. The American commander on the other side of that wall is George S. Patton, the man of speed, the cavalryman whose Third Army had just torn 400 miles across France in a single summer, who believed, as he wrote in his own field manual, that in mobility lies the strength of an army. And here, in front of a row of 19th century forts on a wet hillside in Lorraine, that army has stopped. It has been stopped by concrete. It has been stopped by a German general named Otto von Knobelsdorff, who commands the German First Army and who has been told by Adolf Hitler personally that fortress commanders are to hold their positions at all costs. Surrender requires Hitler's approval. Hitler will never give it. So the German officer inside Fort Driant, listening to the wall, has done the math the way his doctrines taught him to do it. He believes the Americans will bleed against this concrete until the man on the other side, the man of pursuit, the man who does not stop, finally stops. For most of October, he is right. This is the part of Patton's war that the clean version of the story usually skips. Not Normandy, not the Bulge. The 2 months in between, when the general of maneuver walked into a war of stone, mud, and patience, and had to decide in front of his own staff and in front of his own boss what he was actually going to do about it. Because what Patton did at Metz was not what the legend of Patton would predict. To understand why a German officer inside Fort Driant believed he was winning, you have to look at the ground he was standing on. Metz had been a fortress city since the 1870s. When the Germans annexed Lorraine after the Franco-Prussian War, they spent 50 years building a ring of forts around the city. Then the French got it back in 1918 and reinforced it. Then the Germans took it back in 1940 and reinforced it again. By the autumn of 1944, 43 interconnected forts stood around Metz. Concrete casemates, underground galleries, armored gun turrets, dry moats, belts of barbed wire, tunnel systems that ran for kilometers beneath the soil. The 2 strongest were the ones that mattered. Fort Driant, southwest of the city, 14 guns. Fort Jeanne d'Arc, to the north, 12 guns. Wide fields of fire across the river crossings of the Moselle. Both built to be impossible. Now add Hitler's order from March of 1944. Fortress commanders were not to retreat. They were to hold each work and each strong point to the last. Surrender required Hitler's personal approval, which functionally meant surrender required Hitler's death. The garrison of Metz was bolted to its concrete by the same regime that built it. And then add the third thing. The weather. By late September of 1944, the Lorraine sky had turned gray and stayed gray. The rain came down for weeks. The Moselle rose and fell and rose again. The fields turned into something the engineers stopped calling mud and started calling soup. American tanks slid sideways on hillsides. Bridging operations on the river were ranged in by German guns sitting in concrete 5 miles away. So when the German officer inside Driant counted the seconds between impacts, he was not being foolish. He was reading the war the way his doctrine had taught him to read it. He had concrete that did not crack. He had an order from his head of state that he could not disobey even if he wanted to.
As such,
He had rain that punished the attacker. And he had, on the other side of that wall, an American army whose entire summer had been built around speed. An army that ran on gasoline that was now being rationed, on roads that were now mud, against a target that did not move. Here is the detail that turns the whole picture from strange into terrifying. For most of October, the math worked. On September 27th, after a regimental attack by the 90th Infantry Division failed against Fort Jeanne d'Arc, Patton committed the 5th Infantry Division to Fort Dryant. The men called it the Red Diamonds. They had crossed France from the hedgerows of Normandy to the Moselle without serious resistance. Dryant was different. One engineer of the 5th, Tom Tucker of the 7th Combat Engineer Battalion, looked at the slope of the fort under American artillery and said it was like the face of the moon. Craters, wire, scorched concrete, nothing alive on the surface. They attacked anyway. For 2 weeks, the 5th Infantry Division fought for a piece of ground the size of a small village. They got onto the surface of Fort Dryant. They could not get inside it. The barbed wire ran in 3 belts. The pillboxes interlocked. American flamethrowers were turned away by armored gun ports. American demolition charges blew holes in concrete that the Germans simply welded shut from below. Men of the 5th Division learned to live on the moonscape, in shell holes, under tarps, under fire from gun positions they could not see because the gun positions were underneath them. By October 9th, Patton had a problem he could not solve with maneuver, and a boss who had noticed. General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, recorded the exchange himself. Patton's superior arrived to find the 3rd Army's commander still pecking at the walls of Metz. "For God's sake, George, lay off," Bradley said. "I promise you'll get your chance. When we get going again, you can far more easily pinch out Metz and take it from behind. Why bloody your nose in this pecking campaign?" Patton's answer was 4 words long. "We're using Metz to blood the new divisions." Pause on that sentence, because that sentence is the moment the legend of Patton becomes something more interesting than the legend. The man whose entire reputation was built on speed had just told his commanding officer that he was deliberately running a slow war, that the casualties at Dryant, 64 killed, 547 wounded, 187 missing by the time the attack was finally called off, were the tuition cost of training the green replacements who would be needed in the fight that came after Metz. Patton was not failing to do what he was good at. He was running a second machine, one that history mostly forgot because the first machine had stopped working. On the night of October 12th, an engineer of the 5th Division named Tom Tucker pulled the fuse lighter on 6,000 pounds of explosives inside one of Dryant's barracks tunnels. "We pulled the fuse lighter and took off," he remembered. He ran down the hillside in the dark. His helmet fell off. His rifle was gone. He hit the ground rolling and thought he had been shot. He had not. He had just destroyed an American forward position to deny it to the Germans, because the order had finally come. The Americans were pulling back from Fort Dryant. 18 days later, on the cold, dry ground of Halloween night, the big guns of the 3rd Phantom Corps. Artillery were rolled into position along the Moselle in the vicinity of Metz. The fort had not moved. The Americans had changed the machine they were bringing against it. The second machine was not a single weapon. It was a way of refusing to play the game the German officer inside Dryant was counting on. The first piece of it was the bypass. Bradley had told Patton to pinch Metz out from behind. By early November, Patton was doing exactly that, but on his own terms and his own timetable. The 90th Infantry Division and the 10th Armored Division would swing wide to the north of the city. The 5th Infantry Division, the same red diamonds that had bled on the slope of Dryant, would swing in close from the south. The 95th Infantry Division, in the center, would hold the German garrison's attention against the Moselle and the western forts. 4 divisions, 3 jaws, 1 slow closing fist. The second piece was the artillery. The 3rd Phantom Corps Artillery, which had landed in France in September and trained for a month at a quiet village called Carteret on the Cotentin Peninsula, opened fire on November 1st. Their fire missions were laid on the twin forts called North and South Verdun and on Fort Dryant. Not to break Dryant, to watch it. Counter battery the moment its guns spoke. Smother its observation. Make every German artillery officer inside that concrete pay for every shell he tried to fire. The third piece was the weather Patton had been cursing all October, now turned against the people inside the walls. The French water systems the Germans had inherited inside the forts were nearly all broken. Some of the forts, in the dry season, would have surrendered from thirst inside a week. But in October, the rain had been relentless. The garrisons collected it in cisterns. The same rain that had ruined Patton's roads had bought the German commanders water. By mid-November, that bargain was running out. On November 8th, the Dentique Corps attack went in. 5 days later, the 90th Division was across the Moselle, north of Metz. The 10th Armored hooked east. The 5th Division in the south did exactly what it had been blooded to do at Dryant. Only this time it did it against field positions instead of concrete. By November 19th, the jaws were closing. On November 22nd, hostilities inside the city of Metz formally ceased. The forts did not. This is the part the German officer inside Dryant had not modeled. He had built his bet on the assumption that the American on the other side of the wall was going to keep attacking him. By the 3rd week of November, the American was not attacking him anymore. The Third Army was already moving east toward the Saar. Patton had walked past the forts, sealed them from the country behind them, and left them to their own concrete. Inside the walls, the math began to invert. Inside the forts, the math began to invert, but slowly, and not without a cost the American command had not advertised. The 5th Infantry Division alone had lost roughly 1,376 men in November of 1944. The 95th Infantry Division, the ones who would earn the nickname Iron Men of Metz, had lost more than 2,000 by November 22nd. Patton's second machine, the slow one, the patient one, the one that walked past concrete instead of through it, was not bloodless. It was just bleeding differently. It was bleeding in a way that produced ground. The irony is almost cruel. The French water pipes the Germans had inherited inside the forts were rotting from the inside. And that was doing more work than any American howitzer. Fort St. Quentin surrendered on December 6th, with a sizable garrison still alive but out of food and water. Fort Platteville followed the next day, the Thea. Then, at 1545 on December 8th, by one of the fortunes of war, Fort Dryant, the fort that had killed 64 Americans and wounded 547, and made Patton break off an attack in October, surrendered to the same 5th Infantry Division it had bled, 15 minutes before the incoming 87th Division arrived to relieve them. 5 days later, on the cold, gray morning of December the 13th, the last fort of Metz stood in the silence of her own destruction. The Third Corps after-action history wrote the line itself. Battered black by the unrelenting fire of American guns, Fort Jeanne d'Arc lay silent in the squalor of her own destruction, awaiting the dictates of her conquerors on the cold, gray morning of December 13th. At 1100 hours, her commanding officer, a grim-faced young major named Hans Voss indicated that his cause was lost. He contacted the headquarters of the 101st Infantry, 26th Division, of the 3rd Corps and wearily asked for a truce. By 11:15, the negotiations were complete, and slowly, like tired animals emerging from the earth, the columns of his garrison shuffled through the battered doors of the fort and surrendered to American troops. 511 officers and enlisted men stood listlessly while their commander quietly answered the questions of an American brigadier general. The German desire to fight, the document recorded, had dissolved in barren, empty stomachs and shell cases. For me, this is where Patton stops being a cavalryman with a romance and becomes a commander running 2 wars at once. He never abandoned the doctrine of speed. The bulk of the Third Army was already 80 miles east of Metz when Jeanne d'Arc surrendered, racing for the Saar. But against the concrete he found at Metz, he was willing to do something his legend does not credit him for. He was willing to be slow. He was willing to use the city as a school for the divisions that would later relieve Bastogne. He was willing to let the rain and the broken French plumbing of 1902 do work his howitzers could not. He was willing to walk past a fort and let it surrender to its own thirst 3 weeks later. If you care about the men who did the quiet work that made the visible victory possible, the engineers like Tucker on the Moonscape, the artillerymen of the Phantom Corps on the Moselle on Halloween night, the riflemen of the Red Diamonds and the Iron Men of Metz. This is exactly that kind of story. Now go back to the German officer inside Fort Dryant, the one we left at the beginning, counting the seconds between American shell impacts and believing he was winning. He was right about the wall. The wall held. American howitzers never broke into Fort Dryant from above. American demolitions never cracked the casemate that sheltered him in October. The concrete his nation had poured in 1902 did exactly what it was built to do. He was wrong about the man on the other side. The man on the other side did not have to break his wall. The man on the other side closed the country behind him, stopped feeding him, stopped giving him water, walked past him toward the Saar, and waited. When the doors of Fort Jeanne d'Arc finally opened on the morning of December the 13th, the war that came out of them was not the war the German officer had been counting on. It was a war that had decided very quietly, 2 months earlier, that it would not be fought on the wall's terms. What Patton did when German officers thought Metz would stop him was something simpler and colder than the legend remembers. He stopped trying to break the wall. He broke the country around it instead.